My father chose his new wife over me. Years later, she left him broke and he came crawling back. I was 16 when my father sat me down and told me he was getting remarried. What he didn't tell me was that I was about to become invisible in my own family. What happened next destroyed our relationship for years, but karma had plans of her own, and when my father finally realized what he'd lost, it was far too late. Let me take you back to where it all started. My mother passed away when I was 14. Cancer took her slowly, painfully, and those 2 years of watching her fade away were the hardest of my life. My dad and I became incredibly close during that time. We were a team, grieving together, healing together, or at least I thought we were. We'd have movie nights every Friday. He'd help me with my homework at the kitchen table, and we'd talk for hours about Mom, keeping her memory alive. Those moments meant everything to me. They were all I had left of the family I once knew. Then he met Vanessa. It happened about 18 months after Mom died. He met her at some work conference. She was 35, 12 years younger than him, and she came into our lives like a hurricane. At first, I tried to be happy for him. I really did. I thought maybe this meant he was healing, that we both could start moving forward. My dad seemed lighter, happier, and after all the darkness we'd been through, I wanted that for him. But things changed fast, way too fast. 6 months after they met, Dad announced they were getting married. 6 months! My mother had been gone for just 2 years, and suddenly there was this stranger wearing white moving into our house, sleeping in my mother's bedroom, rearranging furniture that still held my mother's touch. Vanessa didn't even try to get to know me first. There was no slow introduction, no effort to build a relationship. One day she was Dad's girlfriend, the next she was my stepmother, and I was just expected to accept it. The wedding was small, thankfully. I stood there in a dress I hated, forcing a smile for the pictures, feeling like I was betraying my mother's memory just by being there. Dad was so wrapped up in his new bride that he didn't notice I cried through the entire ceremony. Or maybe he did notice and just didn't care anymore. After the wedding, everything fell apart. Vanessa wanted to redecorate. She started with the living room, removing the photos of my mother that Dad and I had carefully displayed. Then she moved to their bedroom, boxing up Mom's jewelry, her books, the little trinkets that held our memories. When I protested, Dad told me I needed to be more understanding, that Vanessa deserved to feel comfortable in her own home. Her home. Not our home anymore. Hers. Our Friday movie nights disappeared. Vanessa didn't like the movies I chose. She said they were too depressing or too childish, so we stopped watching movies together altogether. The kitchen table where Dad used to help me with homework became Vanessa's workspace for her online boutique. She'd spread her inventory everywhere, leaving no room for me. When I tried to study there anyway, she'd complain that I was in her way. But the worst part wasn't what changed. It was how my father allowed it to happen. Every time I tried to talk to him, Vanessa was there. Every time I needed his advice or just wanted to spend time with him, she had plans for them. Dinner reservations, weekend trips, couples massage appointments. It was like I'd become a ghost in my own house, watching my father fall deeper and deeper under her spell while I faded into the background. I started spending more time in my room. What else could I do? Downstairs, I could hear them laughing together, watching the TV shows Vanessa liked, cooking meals I wasn't invited to help prepare. Dad stopped asking about my day. He stopped checking my grades. He stopped showing up to my school events. I had a piano recital that spring, something I'd been practicing for months. Mom had always come to every single one. I left a ticket on Dad's desk with a note. The night of the recital, I scanned the audience, hoping to see him walk in late. He never came. He'd gone to dinner with Vanessa instead. When I got home, he didn't even apologize. That's when I realized I'd truly lost him. Things got progressively worse over my junior year. Vanessa started making comments about college, about how expensive it was going to be, how she and Dad were planning to travel more and needed to save money. She'd say these things right in front of me with this sweet smile on her face, and Dad would just nod along. My mother had left me a college fund, not a huge amount, but enough to cover a state school. It was in a trust with Dad as the administrator until I turned 18. You can probably guess where this is going. One night, about a month before my 18th birthday, I overheard them arguing in their bedroom. The walls in our house were thin, and I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but Vanessa's voice carried. She was talking about the trust fund, about how it wasn't fair that I had this money sitting there when they had expenses, when they wanted to remodel the kitchen and take a trip to Europe. She actually said it wasn't fair. My dead mother's money that she'd saved for my education wasn't fair to her. I expected Dad to shut her down. I waited to hear him defend me, to tell her that money was sacred, that it was the last thing my mother had given me. Instead, I heard him say he'd look into it, that maybe there was a way to access it for family expenses and he'd pay it back before I needed it for college. I felt sick. I ran to the bathroom and threw up. The next day, I went to the bank myself. I was still 17, but I asked to speak with the trust administrator. I explained my concerns as calmly as I could. The woman I spoke with was kind. She told me that because of how my mother had set up the trust, my father couldn't touch it without my signature once I turned 18. But until then, technically, he could make withdrawals as the administrator. She advised me to keep a close eye on the account and gave me online access so I could monitor it. For the next month, I checked that account every single day, my heart pounding each time I logged in, terrified I'd see the balance dropping. The day I turned 18, I went straight to the bank and had my father removed as administrator. The entire amount was still there. I'd beaten them to it, but just barely. A week later, Dad asked me to sign some papers. He said it was just routine stuff for the trust. I refused. That's when Vanessa's mask finally came off. She exploded, called me selfish, ungrateful, spoiled, said I was living in their house rent-free, eating their food, and refusing to contribute to the family. My father stood right there and let her say all of it. When she finally stopped screaming, I looked at my dad and asked him if he agreed with her. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just said that family helps family, and I was being difficult. That's when I knew I had to leave. I graduated high school 2 months later. Dad and Vanessa didn't come to the ceremony. They'd planned a vacation to the Bahamas that week and said they couldn't change it. My aunt, my mother's sister, came instead. She was the one who hugged me, who took photos, who took me out to dinner after. She was the one who'd been checking on me throughout the year, who'd noticed how withdrawn I'd become. Over dinner, I told her everything. She was furious. She offered to let me live with her while I attended community college. I accepted immediately. 2 weeks after graduation, while Dad and Vanessa were at work, Aunt Marie helped me pack up my stuff. I took my clothes, my books, the few photos of my mother that I'd hidden in my room, and I left. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say goodbye. I just left. My father called me 3 days later. Not to ask if I was okay or where I was, but to yell at me for leaving without permission, for being disrespectful. I told him I was 18 and didn't need his permission. He demanded to know where I was. I refused to tell him. He said if I didn't come home immediately, I shouldn't bother coming back at all. So I didn't. Years passed. I worked full-time and put myself through community college, then transferred to a state university. It was hard. Incredibly hard, but Aunt Marie helped when she could, and I was determined. I made the dean's list. I graduated with honors. I got a good job at a marketing firm. I built a life for myself, a life my mother would have been proud of. During those years, my father tried to reach out a few times. Birthday texts that felt obligatory, an email at Christmas, but he never apologized. He never acknowledged what he'd done. And Vanessa? She sent me a friend request on Facebook once, which I immediately deleted. I blocked both of them on everything. I needed to move forward, and they were anchors pulling me back to the worst time of my life. Through Aunt Marie, I heard snippets about them. They'd remodeled the kitchen. They'd bought a boat. They were taking extravagant vacations to Italy, Thailand, Australia. Dad had taken out a second mortgage on the house to fund their lifestyle. Vanessa had convinced him to invest in her business ideas, none of which seemed to make any money. I tried not to care. They'd made their choice, and I'd made mine. Then, about 5 years after I left, Aunt Marie called me with news.
Vanessa had left my father. Apparently, she'd been having an affair with someone she'd met at a business conference, a wealthy investor who promised her the world. She'd filed for divorce, and because they'd been married for 7 years by then, she was entitled to half of everything. The house, the retirement accounts, all of it. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a flicker of satisfaction, but mostly I just felt sad. Sad for my father, who'd thrown away his relationship with his daughter for a woman who'd used him. Sad for the time we'd lost. Sad for how predictable it all was. The divorce was brutal from what I heard. Vanessa hired an aggressive lawyer and took Dad to the cleaners. She got the house and the settlement, my childhood home, the place where my mother had lived and loved and died, went to a woman who'd never cared about either of us. Dad had to move into a small apartment. His retirement was cut in half. The boat was sold to pay legal fees. Everything he'd worked for was gone. I thought that would be the end of it, but 6 months after his divorce was finalized, my father called me from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. His voice was different, older, tired. He asked if we could meet for coffee. Said he needed to talk to me. I should have said no. I should have protected myself. But there was a part of me, that 16-year-old girl who'd lost her dad, who wanted to hear what he had to say. So I agreed. We met at a cafe halfway between our cities. I got there first and barely recognized him when he walked in. His hair was almost completely gray. His face was lined with stress, and he looked smaller somehow, diminished. He ordered a coffee and sat down across from me, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Then he started talking. He told me about the divorce, about how Vanessa had cleaned him out. He told me he was living in a studio apartment, that he'd had to go back to work part-time because his retirement wasn't enough. He told me he was struggling to pay his bills, that he'd made mistakes with money, that everything had fallen apart. And then he asked me for help.
He needed money. Not a small amount either. He wanted me to lend him $20,000 to get back on his feet. Said he'd pay me back, that he just needed a bridge to get through this tough time. He reminded me about the trust fund, about how my mother would want me to help family. I sat there, staring at this man who was my father in name only, and I felt nothing but emptiness. He hadn't asked how I was. Hadn't asked about my life, my job, whether I was happy. He hadn't apologized for missing my graduation, for choosing Vanessa over me, for letting her erase my mother from our home. He hadn't acknowledged the years of pain he'd caused. He just wanted money. I took a sip of my coffee and looked him directly in the eyes. I told him no. I told him that the money my mother left me was used for exactly what she intended, my education. I told him that I had put myself through college, that I'd worked 2 jobs while studying full-time, that I'd done it all without his help or support. I told him that I'd built a good life for myself, and I'd done it despite him, not because of him. He looked shocked, like he genuinely expected me to just hand over the money. He started to argue, to say that I was his daughter and I owed him. That's when something inside me snapped. I leaned forward and asked him where he was when I needed a father. Where was he during my high school graduation? Where was he when I was struggling to pay for textbooks and eating ramen for dinner 3 nights a week? Where was he when I got my first real job, when I moved into my first apartment, when I had the flu and had nobody to take care of me? He'd chosen Vanessa over me at every turn, and now that she'd left him with nothing, he thought he could just show up and I'd forget everything? He tried to interrupt, but I wasn't done. I told him that Vanessa had done to him exactly what he'd done to me. She'd made him feel loved and important, and then she'd discarded him the moment someone better came along. I told him that karma had a funny way of working, and maybe this was his chance to understand how I'd felt all those years ago when he'd abandoned me emotionally. His face crumbled. For the first time in our conversation, he looked truly broken. He started to cry, these awful, gasping sobs. He said he was sorry, that he'd made terrible mistakes, that he'd been a fool. He said Vanessa had manipulated him, that she'd isolated him from me deliberately, that by the time he'd realized what was happening, it was too late. But here's the thing about apologies. They don't erase years of pain. They don't give you back the time you lost. They don't fix what's broken. I told him I appreciated his apology, but it didn't change anything. The damage was done. He'd had years to reach out, to make amends, to be my father again. He'd chosen not to. He'd only come crawling back when he needed something from me. That wasn't love. That wasn't family. That was desperation. I stood up to leave. He grabbed my hand and begged me not to go, said we could fix this, that he'd do better. I pulled my hand away gently and told him that some things can't be fixed. I told him I forgave him because holding on to the anger was poisoning me, but forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation. It didn't mean pretending the past didn't happen. It meant I was choosing to move forward with my life, and that life didn't include him. I walked out of that cafe and I didn't look back. I got in my car and I drove home to my apartment, to my life, to my peace. And I finally felt free. That was 3 years ago. I haven't heard from my father since. Through Aunt Marie, I know he's still struggling financially, still working part-time, still living in that studio apartment. Part of me feels bad for him, but a bigger part of me knows that these are the consequences of his choices, just like building my life was the consequence of mine. I'm doing well now. I've been promoted twice at work. I have amazing friends who feel more like family than my father ever did. I'm in a healthy relationship with someone who values and respects me. I've even started going to therapy to work through the abandonment issues and trust problems that those years created. I'm healing, slowly but surely. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if I'd made different choices. If I'd given him the money, would we have a relationship now? But I know the answer. I would have just been enabling him, teaching him that he could discard me and come back whenever it was convenient. I would have been setting myself on fire to keep him warm, and I'd already done that for too many years. My mother used to tell me that people show you who they are through their actions, not their words. My father showed me that I wasn't his priority. Vanessa showed him that he wasn't hers. And I've shown myself that I'm strong enough to stand on my own, to set boundaries, to choose my own peace over guilt and obligation. There's a photo on my desk at work. It's of me and my mother at my 8th grade graduation. We're both smiling, her arm around my shoulders, and we look genuinely happy. It was taken just a few months before her diagnosis, before everything changed. I look at that photo sometimes, and I tell her about my life, about the choices I've made, and I think she'd be proud of me. Not just for the professional success or the degree on my wall, but for having the strength to walk away from toxicity, even when it wore my father's face. Some people might think I was too harsh, that family should forgive and forget, that I should have helped my father in his time of need. But family is supposed to show up. Family is supposed to protect you, to choose you, to love you unconditionally. My father stopped being family the day he let Vanessa erase me from his life. I learned the hardest way that you can't force someone to prioritize you. You can't make someone see your worth. All you can do is recognize your own value and surround yourself with people who see it too. My father made his choice when I was 16 years old. I made mine when I was 23. And I'm finally at peace with both. To anyone out there who's been made to feel invisible by the people who should love them most, I want you to know something. It's not your fault. You are worthy of love, of priority, of respect. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away from people who can't see that, even if they're family, especially if they're family. Because at the end of the day, you have to live with yourself. You have to look at yourself in the mirror. And I can do that now, with no regrets, knowing I chose myself when nobody else would. That's not selfish. That's survival. That's strength. That's healing. My father chose his new wife over me. She destroyed him and left him with nothing. And when he came crawling back, I chose myself. And I'd make that same choice every single time.